Welcome back, everyone. If you're gearing up for your CSS exams, or honestly, if you just want a masterclass in how national economies actually work under the hood, you are in the perfect place. Today's explainer is all about decoding a brilliant critique of Pakistan's strategic trade policy, drawing directly from the insights of Ishrat Hussain. We're going way beyond the surface-level numbers to understand the structural realities of trade.
Okay, let's dive right into this. For decades, we've seen these grand strategies announced with massive fanfare, only to, well, fizzle out a few years later. The central thesis we're exploring today is that these recurring failures aren't just a matter of bad luck, and they aren't just slightly miscalculated targets either. They stem from deep, systemic implementation issues. The diagnosis has already been made, it's the execution that keeps falling short.
To unpack this, we are going to follow a really specific framework today, which honestly acts as the perfect essay outline for a high-scoring CSS paper. First, we'll look at the trade policy challenge. Then, we'll analyze past policy failures, dive into the export diversification deficit, map out strategies for future growth, and finally, bring it all together for acing that exam.
All right, part one, the trade policy challenge, fixing structural flaws. So as the new strategic trade policy for 2026 to 2031 is being prepped, we absolutely have to recognize something crucial. Policies written on paper don't magically produce results. It's an opportunity to fix structural weaknesses, not just set fresh numbers. The bedrock of any sound economic policy is good governance. And look, good governance isn't just some corporate buzzword. It's the actual mechanism that improves resource allocation, boosts our competitiveness, raises productivity, and literally reduces the transaction costs of doing business. If you're writing an essay on why 3 decades of strategies have fallen flat, this right here is your core evidence. Because without governance reforms, the new trade policy is practically guaranteed to be a repeat of the old ones.
Moving on to part 2, past policy failures, targets versus reality.
We need an impartial, critical look at the last 2 policies to see exactly where the disconnect between expectations and reality happened. And the data brilliantly illustrates this stark gap. The strategic trade policy for 2021 to 2026 set this highly ambitious target of $57 billion in exports. The reality? A mere $32 billion. And unfortunately, this isn't an isolated incident. The policy right before it, from 2015 to 2020, similarly targeted $35 billion, but only scraped together about $20.5 billion.
This immense gap really forces us to ask some tough rhetorical questions. Were these targets just wildly optimistic from the get-go, or did we completely fail to assess our actual production capacity before setting them? Even more importantly, did institutions like the National Export Promotion Board, which by the way is chaired by the Prime Minister, did they actually meet to resolve implementation bottlenecks? Because issues like excessive taxation, crippling energy prices, and a soaring cost of doing business were left entirely unchecked while these shiny targets were confidently announced.
Now, if you want to write a truly nuanced CSS essay, you have to distinguish between what we can't control and what we can. Yes, external shocks like COVID-19, the devastating floods, the Ukraine war, and Middle East tensions absolutely severely disrupted global supply chains. But, they don't tell the whole story. Domestic policy choices played a massive role as well. For instance, between 2013 and 2018, the exchange rate was effectively fixed, which led to an overvalued currency. That specific domestic choice stagnated exports at around $25 billion and made imported inputs way more expensive.
The cumulative result of all these domestic missteps? Well, it's captured in one incredibly dramatic statistic. By 2025, exports as a share of GDP had shrunk down to just 7.9%. That is a massive, massive drop from 13.1% back in 2005. To put that into perspective, it proves exactly how domestic policy steadily eroded the export sector's footprint relative to the broader economy over 2 decades.
Which brings us to part 3, export diversification, the structural deficit.
The numbers here are just glaring. Over 4/5, we're talking 80% of Pakistan's exports remain entirely stuck in traditional sectors like textiles, food products, and leather. That is almost the exact same proportion as a decade ago. And it doesn't stop at the products, it's the buyers too. Over 60% of these exports go to just 4 destinations: the US, the EU, China, and the UAE. We are incredibly vulnerable simply because we're highly concentrated in both what we sell and who we sell it to.
A perfect case study for this is the EU GSP Plus status gained back in 2014. Now, on one hand, it was absolutely a success. It expanded exports significantly by giving preferential access to European markets. But we completely failed to evolve beyond low-technology, resource-based products. We use this amazing access just to pump out more traditional cotton textiles. We completely missed the boat on the rapid global growth in synthetic fiber products and technical textiles. Basically, we grabbed the lowest hanging fruit and just stopped reaching.
Now, what's really interesting about this is what is actually missing from the economy. The broader export basket lacks any meaningful presence in medium and high-tech sectors. We are missing out on electronics, engineering goods, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, medical equipment, e-mobility components, the list goes on. These missed sectors are the ones that command a massive, growing share of world trade. These are the industries that actually offer global productivity gains and support higher wages for the workforce.
All right, part 4, strategies for future growth. Reversing this trend is going to require a really logical progression, basically fixing the manufacturing pipeline step by step. Step 1, we have to gradually reduce domestic taxes and tariffs on imported raw materials like synthetic fibers to immediately improve competitiveness. Step 2, we desperately need a medium-term industrial policy to build upstream industries. Think of a petrochemical complex that can actually supply those raw materials domestically. And Step 3, use that strengthened base to integrate deeply into global value chains, showing exactly how tariff reforms and industrial policies must reinforce each other.
To actually make this happen, the Commerce Ministry and the National Export Promotion Board have to focus on concrete steps that are entirely within their direct control. First, they need to aggressively pursue preferential trade agreements well beyond our traditional partners, looking at ASEAN, the GCC, Japan, the UK, and the US. On the regulatory front, the Pakistan single window must be extended to cover all remaining agencies to truly digitize trade, and crucially for investment, the government has to enact a formal stability clause. Investors need a rock-solid guarantee that major policies won't be abruptly reversed without consultation. We also definitely need to restore the export facilitation scheme and expand export financing.
But above all else, the new policy needs a heavy dose of realism. In today's volatile world, just throwing out a single-point export target is practically meaningless. Policymakers have to present a range of possible outcomes based on massive global shifts, things like AI, climate change, shifting demographics, and geopolitics. And they absolutely cannot do this in a vacuum. Substantive consultations with existing exporters, the people on the ground who actually understand the regulatory obstacles and market opportunities, they must be the ones shaping the policy design to ensure assumptions stay robust.
Finally, part 5, acing the CSS exam.
Okay, so bringing all these economic and governance elements together, here is your argument blueprint. When you're writing your essay, structure it around these core truths. Pakistan's export constraints are no longer a mystery. The diagnosis is already well known. The true analytical focal point you need to hammer home is that implementation and coordination are the real challenges. You need to prove that good governance fundamentally outranks ambitious target setting. Argue that without policy consistency, no amount of strategic planning is going to survive contact with reality.
So the crucial point is perfectly summarized by Ishrat Hussain himself. He notes that the next strategic trade policy should be judged not by the size of its export targets, but by the credibility of its assumptions, the coherence of its implementation, and its ability to produce measurable results. Definitely write that down, because this is an incredibly powerful, high-scoring, concluding thought to anchor any essay on trade policy.
I want to leave you with this final interview-style challenge today. Based on the structural bottlenecks and governance issues we've just mapped out, as a future policymaker, how would you evaluate the government's credibility in implementing the next strategic trade policy? Really think about the specific evidence you'd look for. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep structuring those thoughts, and I'll catch you in the next one.